Okay, so this time we're going to talk about digestion. This is chapter 9 in your human biology textbook. So we'll talk about what the different organs are, what their functions are, um, and we'll talk about the structure of the wall. I'll let you know that most of the digestive system, the wall is made out of 2 layers of muscle, like in the esophagus, 2 layers. When you get to the stomach, you got 3 layers of muscle. You have an extra diagonal layer, and that diagonal layer lets you twist the stomach a little bit as you slosh the food and the stomach acid back and forth to mix them together well. And then the other exception, you get down to the large intestine, most of that muscle is gone. You're left with little tiny strips of muscle. They're called the tenacoli, the tendinous cords. They're not actually tendons, they're muscles, but they're that thin, and they exist mainly to move food along. But we'll get to that. All right. So the gastrointestinal tract, the GI tract, that's also called the digestive system. They hydrolyze or break down food. Lyes from lice, meaning to break, and hydro from water, because a lot of this is things like, say you're digesting a protein, you're going to break it down into individual amino acids. Well, the amino acids are held together with peptide bonds. So you can use an enzyme to shove a water in between 2 amino acids, put an H on one side and an OH on the other, and you break the bond, it floats away. That addition of water, hydro, to break lice, that's where we get hydrolyze. Anyway, moving on. So we're doing this to break complex things like starches into monosaccharides, big long things like proteins into little amino acids, big fats like triglycerides down into the fatty acids and the glycerol. These smaller molecules can get across the plasma membrane easier. Some of them you still have to actively pump. Some of them you have proteins that help them across, but it's not active transport because it doesn't require energy. Anyway, in all of them, the goal is to take the big molecule and break it into little parts that can get across the membrane easier. And those nutrients are transported mostly by our blood. I say mostly because we have the lacteals in the lymphatic system that we just talked about that are full of fats coming off the intestines. Anyway, moving on. All right, here's a list of organs. On the right side of this picture, you see digestive tract organs. There's nothing there surprising. Mouth, pharynx, esophagus, stomach, small intestine. There are 3 parts you're going to need to know: the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. And I want you to know that most of the digestion happens in the duodenum. Some people say duodenum. Don't really care which way you say it. Anyway, so stomach, small intestine, and large intestine is going to have parts too. It's the colon, and we're going to have the ascending colon and the transverse colon and the descending colon and the sigmoid colon. And be thankful that you are a human, because if you were a horse, you'd have a lot more parts than that. Anyway, but you have a large intestine, the colon, and it has those parts. Then you have the rectum. Rectus is Latin for straight. This is that little part right at the end that's a straight shot out of the body, the rectum. And then the anus, which actually controls the passage of feces out of the body. Anyway, so those are the digestive tract organs. But on the other side, we have the accessory organs. These are things that don't get mentioned as often as they should. They say salivary glands. I would actually put teeth there too as an accessory to the digestive system. But teeth, salivary glands, the liver, a huge amount of chemicals are produced by the liver. But the number one most important thing they're going to talk about here is the bile that comes from the gallbladder. It's made in the liver, stored in the gallbladder. And when you pass a bunch of fats from the stomach into the duodenum, the first part of the small intestine, to break those fats down more easily, you mix them with the bile, which emulsifies the fat. Fancy way of saying you break it into a bunch of little drops, so you increase the surface area, give the enzymes more surface to chew on those lipids and break them down. The pancreas, super important. The pancreas is not just an endocrine thing that makes insulin. It's super famous for that. But also, the pancreas makes a whole ton of digestive enzymes for use in the duodenum, in the small intestine. And it makes basic solution, bicarbonate-filled solution, that will neutralize the acidity of the food coming from the stomach. This makes sense because the stomach, where we make the acid, it's hardened against the acid. There are three methods that make it tough against the acid. We'll talk about that later if you want. But the stomach, where you make the stomach acid, it's strong. It does a better job of surviving it than the intestine would. When you pass that through the pyloric sphincter into the small intestine, that acid could destroy the small intestine if you don't neutralize it. You neutralize it by bringing in that basic pancreatic fluid full of bicarbonate solution. And of course, that denatures the stomach enzymes, and you have to replace them with intestinal enzymes that also come from the pancreas and work at that higher pH. All right, so let's move on. Digestion happens in stages. Ingestion is taking food into the mouth. Digestion is breaking it down. Mechanical digestion is what happens in the mouth or in the stomach when we are mixing the food and breaking it apart. That's mechanical digestion. Chemical digestion is what we talked about before, turning proteins into amino acids and fats into glycerol and fatty acids, turning carbohydrates into little monomers of glucose. This begins in the mouth with, say, salivary amylase is a starch digesting enzyme in the mouth, in the saliva. And that continues in the stomach, where you have protein digesting enzymes. And we finish off the chemical digestion in the small intestine, which is where most digestion happens. It's real important to know the stomach is a mixing container area. It holds food, it mixes food with acid and with enzymes. Most of the digestion, most of the breakdown is actually small intestine. And most of the absorption of the food is also small intestine. All right, so movements of digestion, or stages of digestion continued. So we went through mechanical digestion, chemical digestion. Now we have movement, passing the food from one organ to the next. This is smooth muscle contractions. We call it peristalsis. If you think about when you swallow, when the food gets about there in your throat, it just goes straight down. One of the layers of muscle in the stomach, in the digestive system, is circular. You've got muscle fibers that wrap around the esophagus. And so this ring can contract, and then this ring, and then this ring, and then this ring, and then this one, and then this one, and this one, and this one. So when you go, it forces the food down. That's peristalsis. It doesn't just happen there. It happens in the small intestines. You're moving food along. Anyway, absorption is moving things, nutrients, from the inside of the GI tract, from the lumen, across the wall of the intestine, across the wall of the digestive organ, into the blood. And then it's carried from blood to liver to cells. Actually to the liver and detoxified and then off to cells. Anyway, elimination is getting rid of the stuff you can't digest. Defecation, this will sound crude, but pooping, that's defecation, removing the feces from the body. Okay, so the digestive tract, we have a space in the middle of the organ we call a lumen. And then around that, lining that, we have a mucosa. That's the innermost layer. It makes mucus. And in some places, we're making digestive enzymes as well. The mucus, sorry about the barking dog. The mucus will help lubricate and make it easy to pass things through. And the enzymes, of course, will help with the chemical breakdown. The submucosa is the loose connective tissue underneath the mucosa. It contains the blood vessels, the lymphatic vessels, the nerves. Those are things that, like the blood for the mucosa that gives it the nutrients it needs. Sorry, gives it the oxygen it needs. The lymphatic vessels, those are like the lacteals I talked about, where you the lymph suddenly looks white because it's picking up fats. The muscularis, and it says made of 2 layers of smooth muscle, an inner circular layer, that's the one I was talking about that does the peristalsis, and an outer longitudinal layer. I'm going to give you, then it says that move the food along the GI tract. I'm going to give you the 2 exceptions again. The muscularis in the stomach has 3 layers, and the muscularis in the large intestine is so reduced that you only have those outer 3 little tendon-looking bands. You don't have the circular layer. Anyway, and then the serosa, the outer layer, it's also called visceral peritoneum. Remember, visceral, like very close, in this case, stuck to the organ, and because it's a serous membrane, the peritoneum, it's double layered and filled with lubricating fluid and very, very slippery. All right. So here we have a nice drawing. It's a pretty picture, and it has all the stuff that we were saying. I want you to notice that the 2 layers here, like I said, we have 3. This is probably intestine. And I say that because you see these circular grooves, circular ridges. Those would be what we call villi. And then on each villi, you have lots of little tiny folds. Those would be microvilli. Okay. So villi lined with microvilli. You actually have 3 layers of, 3 layers of increasing surface area. So this is probably circular folds, and this would be villi, and then on, too small to see, each one of those little whitish yellow things that sticks up, it will be covered in microvilli. All right, moving on. Diverticulosis. All right. Diverticula are little pouches that are in the large intestine. Okay. And these little pouches form whenever you have the mucosa push through the wall. Remember, the wall is reduced in the large intestine. You don't have the circular layer of muscles, and so that inner mucosa can be pushed out between the strips of longitudinal muscle and form these little pouches. That by itself is not a huge deal, but it can get impacted, it can get infected and inflamed. Itis means inflamed, so diverticulitis is the inflammation of these little diverticula. Having the diverticula is diverticulosis. You see itis, it's inflamed. And between 10% and a quarter of the people who have it, who have the sacs, have diverticulosis, form diverticulitis. They get inflamed. All right, other bowel diseases. There's inflammatory bowel disease that gives you diarrhea all the time. abdominal pain, fever, weight loss. There's irritable bowel syndrome. Contractions of the muscle cause abdominal pain, constipation, and or diarrhea. I know those are opposite things. Irritable bowel disease, we don't actually have 100%. We're not sure what's causing it. Anyway, here's a check your memory 9.1. I'm going to pause for a moment and you can stop the video. You can go back and look and make sure you can answer all this stuff. Okay, let's move on. So we're going to talk about the mouth, the pharynx, and the esophagus. And we'll talk about functions. We'll talk about how you swallow. The big thing that we want to emphasize there's this thing that we call the epiglottis, the hole in the windpipe. Your trachea, your windpipe, is in front of your esophagus. So say the face is here and the back of the head is here. All right, we're going to have the windpipe, the trachea here. We're going to have the esophagus here. When you swallow, that food has to cross the windpipe without going into it. And the way we do that is that as we swallow, we have a thing called an epiglottis. Epi means above. The glottis is the hole in the windpipe. When you swallow, the epiglottis will go like that, and the food or drink should slide down the epiglottis into the esophagus, missing the trachea that's here. And the epiglottis, because it's elastic cartilage, it'll spring back and be ready for the next swallow. Anyway, but we'll go through that. And we'll talk about some diseases and conditions with the mouth, the pharynx, the esophagus. They'll probably talk here about refluxing and heartburn and how that the acid can actually degrade the lining of the esophagus, because stomach's hardened against acid, other parts not so much. Let's move on. All right, so the mouth is the oral cavity. That's where we start mechanical and chemical digestion. When we say start mechanical, I'm talking about chewing, mixing the food with the saliva. Chemical, I'm talking about enzymes in the saliva, things like salivary amylase that breaks down starch. The roof of your mouth here, it separates the nasal cavity from the oral cavity. And there are two parts. Close to the teeth, we have the bony hard palate. And if you push your finger back far enough, it stops feeling hard. That's because there's a soft palate. The soft palate, there's still a divider, but it's muscle with no bone there. And it ends at that part that you see in all the cartoons that hangs down. That's a uvula. And the purpose for that is when you swallow, when you pass liquid or food back and you swallow, the uvula should go up. Remember, the epiglottis came down to keep things out of the trachea here. Well, when you swallow and you have the uvula hanging, it should fold up to block the passage up into the nose. So you swallow, and as you're swallowing, nothing can go up into the nose. You might say, oh, but I had this friend who he was laughing and then the soda came out of his nose. Yeah, totally true. Because you shouldn't be eating and laughing and talking all at the same time. If you do, you've got kind of a fight between, are we passing food or passing air? Because when you're passing air, you want that uvula down so you can pass air up into the nasal cavity. It helps us make sounds the way we do. But when you're swallowing, you want the uvula up so you can't pass air. If someone's laughing or swallowing, they're laughing or talking too much while swallowing. They're like air, no air, air, no air, air, no air. And the swallow could come at the wrong time. And if it's down because you're passing air and then you swallow, you might be able to have air come up and push the food or liquid out. I have blown root beer out my nose before. It's so not comfortable. All right, moving on. You know, the uvula is the hanging down part that's supposed to seal off the nasopharynx, keep it separate from the oropharynx, the oral part. The tonsils are at the back of the mouth on either side. They're full of lymphatic tissue. Remember, that's where we keep macrophages, neutrophils that look for invading pathogens that need to be destroyed. That's what they mean when they say help protect from disease. Also says there's a single pharyngeal tonsil in the nasopharynx. That means up above the uvula, and it's commonly called the adenoid. So, fine. These tonsils, we'll talk about. They have little, like little box cages going back into them that we call the crypts, and the stuff gets caught in there, and that's where that gives plenty of time. If a little bit of food gets swallowed into there, as long as it doesn't stay there, when you're swallowing, if a little bit of food or liquid passes in there, that lets the white blood cells take a look at what you're bringing in and see if it's something to freak out about or not. All right, so here we have a mouth. We have the hard palate, that's bone. It's bone all the way to here. Here we have the soft palate, that's muscle. We have the uvula hanging down. That's the thing that'll swing up to block the passage of food into the nasopharynx. Here we have tonsils. The adenoid would be above. They didn't mention it yet, but you have tonsil below the tongue, the sublingual tonsil. Anyway, right here they have the dental formula. That surprises me. I would have thought we'd do that later, but okay. When you look at the adult human dental formula, it's 2123. They have this published for all the animals. You can look it up. In humans, it's 2123. What that means is that on one jaw, upper or lower, for a lot of animals, they have a separate set of numbers for the upper and the lower jaw. But in us, it's the same. As an adult, it's 2123. What that means is right here in the center, we have the two teeth. Those are incisors. Well, we had two pairs of incisors in the middle. If you look right here, this is a pair and that is a pair. So we only count one side. We say two incisors, one canine or eye tooth, that's our kind of pointy one, two premolars, and three molars. And I know some of you are going to be counting like, that's not right. I don't have that many molars. I only have two molars. And you're right, because they pulled your wisdom teeth. Okay. But that would be the natural condition, 2, 1, 2, 3. All right, so we've got three pairs of salivary glands, and they make saliva. And saliva has salivary amylase, which helps to break down carbohydrates, and it has lysozyme, which helps to kill bacteria. Great. The tongue is covered in taste buds, and it mixes the food. It moves it over into line with the teeth, so the teeth can smash it and chew it up real good. And it moves upward and helps the swallow to push the food down the esophagus. We call the mixture of chewed food and saliva a bolus. So we move that bolus towards the pharynx. The pharynx is the space at the back of the throat, and it's subdivided into three parts. Up and back of the nose, we call it the nasopharynx. In back of the oral cavity, the mouth, we call it the oropharynx. And in back of the voice box, the larynx, we call it the laryngopharynx. All right, so moving on. Teeth help us to mechanically digest food. I told you they should have listed that as an accessory organ. We have 20 deciduous teeth, baby teeth, 32 adults. The root is the portion below the gum. The crown is the part above the gum. When we look at a tooth, the outside is super, super hard. It's enamel, but it's also brittle. You wouldn't want to build a whole tooth out of that, or it'd crack real easy. The dentin is more like bone, okay? Has a little bit of give, a little bit of flex. It's tough, not hard. The pulp is the part in the middle that has the nerves, that has the blood vessels. And then the thing that anchors it into the jawbone is called a periodontal ligament that holds the tooth into the jaw. And if you want to know something really weird about sharks, shoot me a line. I'll tell you about the periodontal ligaments in white-spotted bamboo sharks. It's totally awesome. Anyway, but we're doing human biology here, so let's move on. All right, so again, we have the gum, which, by the way, the gum is called the gingiva. It wasn't listed there, but the gum is the gingiva. That's why gingivitis is a thing. The term means inflammation of the gum. But anyway, anything above the gingiva, above the gum, that's the crown. Anything below it is the root. As we move from outside in, above talking about the crown and only the crown, here we have the enamel, and then the dentin, and then the pulp cavity. All right, so, and here we have the bone of the jaw. It forms the socket that the tooth goes down into. And the periodontal ligament is, you see all these little connective tissue pieces coming across like that. What they're doing, every one of them is attaching on one side to the bone and on the other side to the tooth. One side to the bone, other side to the tooth. One side of the bone, other side of the tooth. And as you work up there, lots and lots of connections. All right, so dental caries, that's the fancy way of talking about a cavity. It's the anatomy way to talk about it. This happens when bacteria break down sugar and make acid as a byproduct, which erodes the teeth. If you've already done metabolism in one of your classes, you know that if you're breaking down sugar and making acids, you're probably doing this without oxygen. You're like, why? What? How is there no oxygen in the human body? Well, actually, the space between the tooth and the gingiva and the gum, there's very little oxygen right there. So these bacteria, a lot of times they're working anaerobically without oxygen, and they produce acids as a byproduct. Those acids can break down the enamel on your teeth. Oh, and here we're finally going to talk about gingiva. Gingivitis is inflammation of the gums. Remember, itis means inflammation. Gingiva are the gums. And that can spread to the periodontal ligament. If it does, it can loosen a tooth, and you can lose a tooth. All bad. Let's move on. The mouth and the nasal passages both lead to the pharynx. The pharynx opens into the esophagus for food and the trachea for air. The two tubes are parallel to each other. Like I said, the trachea closer to the front and the esophagus behind that, okay? So the trachea in front of the esophagus is a muscular tube that goes all the way down to the stomach. When you swallow, you start out doing voluntary movement with your tongue and your upper esophagus, but once you get just a little bit down, so once it is pushed back into the pharynx, this is involuntary. In other words, what I'm saying is when you start that peristalsis of a swallow, you don't halfway through say, oh, I'm done, now I'm not going to swallow. It goes all the way down. Now you can vomit it back up, but it goes all the way down. So food normally enters the esophagus because the other avenues are blocked. What we're talking about is that the epiglottis, here we have our trachea, here we have our esophagus. The epiglottis drops, covers the trachea, nothing goes in, and instead the food slides over the epiglottis, whee, it goes down the esophagus with sound effects. Okay, not really, but. Okay, so the soft palate moves backwards to close off the nasal passage. That's where I was saying that the uvula goes up, okay? And the trachea moves up under the epiglottis. In other words, when you swallow, in fact, try this. Find your Adam's apple, or to speak like an anatomist, your laryngeal prominence. Put your thumb there, put your finger there, swallow. And you'll feel the whole thing go up underneath the skin. Well, what's happening is you are raising the trachea. And as it goes up, the epiglottis is pushed downward, and then the food slides off of it. It covers the, sorry, it goes up, covers the glottis, the whole food slides off of it down the esophagus. So, yay. Hey, here's a pretty picture of it happening. We've talked about that. No big deal. Here is the peristalsis, the second part, picture B. That's the circular rings pushing the food down the esophagus. All right. So peristalsis are contractions that push food through the GI tract. Each one of these is like a sphincter, a ring of muscle. Acts kind of like a valve. When it contracts, it stops the food from moving through it. Where it relaxes, food can go by. The bottom of the esophagus, we have the lower esophageal sphincter. That's between the esophagus and the stomach. And if you reflux, if you pass stomach acid up into the esophagus, past this little lower esophageal sphincter, it'll burn the esophagus. And that esophagus is about the same level as the heart. That's why they call the pain of the acid trying to digest your esophagus, they call that heartburn. It doesn't actually involve your heart. It's just at about the same height, about the same location in the body. Things that make this more common, being overweight, so your body has more weight pushing on the stomach. Overeating, so the stomach is like super expanded and wants to contract and go back to its normal size. Things like that can make it easier to do acid reflux, to pass the acid upwards. All right, let's talk about vomiting. If you get real strong contractions of your abdominal muscles and diaphragm, you can force the contents of the stomach into the esophagus and oral cavity. Like I said, a little bit of that we'd call refluxy, but a large amount, you vomit. That stuff that went down into the stomach is coming right back up. Here's another check your knowledge. I'm going to pause for a bit. You can stop the video. You can see if you answer the questions okay. If you can't answer them, roll the video back and rewatch it. Okay, let's move on. So we've gotten through the mouth and the pharynx and the esophagus. Let's now talk about the stomach, the small intestine, structure of the stomach, role in digestion. I want you to know that we don't actually do a lot of absorption of nutrients with the stomach. We absorb waters, we can absorb alcohol. You do break down proteins a little bit in the stomach, but you finish that in the intestines. You finish the breakdown of lipids in the intestines. You finish the breakdown of carbs in the intestines. The small intestine is the main organ of digestion, not the stomach. I'm not saying the stomach does nothing, but it doesn't do as much as everybody thinks it does. All right, let's see, structure of stomach. You know the muscularis has three layers, muscles go in three directions. And the wall of the stomach inside by the lumen has these folds called rugae in them, but we'll talk about it. Right, so the stomach stores food. It starts the digestion of proteins. Remember, starches start way up in the mouth. Then you get down the stomach, you start proteins. And the stomach, it says, controls movement in food into the small intestine. Let's be a little more clear. The end of the stomach, the tail end, so it's like from stomach to small intestine, there's a sphincter there called the pyloric sphincter. That pyloric sphincter is, see, the stomach has parts of it, like the big bulgy part is the fundus, and then we have the body, and then that narrow part at the end is the pylorus, and that pylorus has a pyloric sphincter. That's a valve that squeezes, and you don't pass all the food out of the stomach all at once. What you do, you get it all mixed up with the stomach acid and the enzymes, and then you open the pyloric sphincter, and squirt a little bit past, and then you close it again. All right, so let's go through this. The stomach stores food, starts the digestion of proteins, and the sphincter at the end and the pylorus, it controls the movement of food into the small intestine. The stomach does not absorb nutrients. Remember, I told you it's not the main organ of digestion, even though so many people think it is. It does absorb alcohol because alcohol is fat soluble and it passes through the membranes easily. Believe it or not, it can pick up water too, even though the book's not listing that. And instead of the normal 2 layers, it's got 3 layers, a circular layer, a longitudinal layer, and an oblique layer. All right. So we got that. So if we look here, the oblique layer they've drawn on the inside, I think that's correct. The longitudinal on the outside. But this part, if they don't say it, this bulgy part here is the fundus. This narrow part here is the pylorus. The stuff in between is the body. This big curve along the stomach, that's the greater curvature. This curve here is the lesser curvature. This is where that lower esophageal sphincter is. Some people call it the cardiac sphincter because of heartburn when it fails. And that means that if this, next to the fundus, this area right here is called the cardiac region. Anyway, so we've got that. Here we have a drawing of gastric pits. That's where our stomach acid comes from. That's where our enzymes come from. We also have goblet cells there that secrete a mucus, and it's a special mucus. It's a mucus that is high in bicarbonate, a basic chemical. That's one of the 3 ways that we harden the stomach against the acid that it makes, is that we coat these cells in the lumen with these cells that are next to the lumen with a mucus that's full of bicarbonate. So down here we have goblet cells that make that mucus. We pass it up here, put it on top of all of these cells, and if the acid is coming along and trying to get down to those cells to digest them, it gets neutralized along the way. Like it's coming, and it gets neutralized, gets neutralized because the acid hits that basic mucus. All right. So there's the cardiac sphincter, which in this book they're calling the lower gastroesophageal sphincter. I can understand there's less confusion because cardiac they're only for heart, but I'll tell you, everybody calls it cardiac. And here we have the pyloric sphincter. We've talked about that. Let's move on. So the mucosa has these folds that are called rugae. They make it, think like the folds in an accordion or the folds in a big saguaro cactus. They allow that thing to expand. Your stomach can fill up with a lot more food, get a lot bigger than it normally is. The mucosa has gastric pits with gastric glands. These glands make gastric juice. I'm talking about the stomach acid. Well, not just the stomach acid. It's the hydrochloric acid, which is pH of 2, very acidic. This kills bacteria and activates pepsin. What they actually release, they release pepsinogen, and the pepsinogen is turned into pepsin by the hydrochloric acid. They have this mucus. Like I said, I want you to know that it's a basic mucus. Helps neutralize the acid. Anything else here? No. The stomach empties in like 2 to 6 hours. We have a special name, just like when we were passing the food down the esophagus, the food mixed with saliva, it was a bolus. Well, the food mixed with stomach acid coming out of the stomach is chyme. C-H-Y-M-E, chyme. And this chyme has to pass through the pyloric sphincter. Like I already told you, it only passes a little bit through at a time. The lining of the esophagus is thinner and more easily damaged than the lining of the stomach. If chyme gets into the esophagus, I'm talking about if you reflux or backwash into the esophagus from the stomach, it will feel like you're on fire. And that's what we call heartburn. because it's about the same height as the heart. Yes, you're a lovely dog. It can be caused by pregnancy or being too heavy, and you have all that extra weight of the fat, extra weight of the baby pushing on the stomach, makes it easy to pass it up, makes it easy for the chyme to pass out of the stomach up the esophagus where you don't want it. If you have reflux all the time, then they call that GERD, gastroesophageal reflux disease. And it basically means you get heartburn all the time. And that's bad because it can actually degrade the bottom of your esophagus. All right, so here we have a picture of normal where the sphincter is closed, and heartburn where we are pushing the chyme up into the esophagus past the sphincter, and this part of the esophagus is getting eaten by acid. Now, I do want to add one other thing. Couple slides back, the hydrochloric acid, it kills bacteria and activates pepsin. It kills most bacteria. There is a bacteria called H. pylori, and that stuff, they live just fine in the stomach, and in fact they can burrow through the wall. Instead of being killed by the stomach acid, they can hang out there, burrow through the wall of the stomach, leaving areas where the acid can get in between the cells in the lining of the stomach into the mucosa and digest those cells. This is one of the main causes of ulcers. Okay, and the guy who discovered that H. pylori caused ulcers, he got the Nobel Prize for it, and he was absolutely crazy. The short version is nobody would believe, or very few people would believe him. He's like, I've discovered the cause of ulcers. They're like, yeah, we already know it's stress. He's like, no, it's this bacteria. And nobody would believe him, and they wouldn't they decided they're going to cut off his funding because it wasn't doing anything interesting. He drank a bacterial culture to prove it, which is just insane. Anyway, but yeah, he got the Nobel Prize. All right. So once we go through the stomach, we go through the pyloric sphincter, letting small amounts of food out into the small intestine. Remember, the small intestine has three parts. There's the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. Most of the digestion is happening in the duodenum. The jejunum is the sausage coil looking thing. The ileum is the part that connects to the large intestine at the ileocecal valve. All right, so the pancreas makes enzymes. The pancreatic duct is where they come from the pancreas into the duodenum. There's also a bile duct that brings in bile made by the liver, stored in the gallbladder. And I already told you that emulsifies the fats. It breaks the bile. When we say emulsifies, all we're saying is it breaks those big droplets of fat into smaller droplets with a lot more surface area that is exposed to the lipase. And the name lipase should tell you anything in ACE is an enzyme, so this is a lipid digesting enzyme. And it works better if you have more surface area. So the bile gives us more surface area by breaking the big drops into little drops of fat. Lipase is made in the pancreas, and it breaks fats into glycerol and fatty acid. I don't like the way this slide is written because some people might mistakenly think bile is also made in the pancreas. It is not. Bile is made by the liver and stored in the gallbladder. All right, so moving on. So what are some of these pancreatic enzymes? Well, you remember in the mouth, we made salivary amylase to start the breakdown of starch. We finish it in the pancreas with pancreatic amylase. It breaks down carbohydrates, breaks down starches. Trypsin, and actually it's trypsinogen, which then gets activated into trypsin. This is a protein digester, and it is released into the duodenum, the first section of the small intestine. There's another protein digester. It is a protein digester. So it's part of the group of things we call proteases, protein digesting enzymes. Here we finally say it. The pancreatic juice has lots of bicarbonate to neutralize the acid in the chyme. Chyme is misspelled here. You already saw it should be CHYME. Moving on. All right, the small intestine has lots of finger-like projections sticking up called villi, and the cells that cover the villi, they have their own little projections called microvilli. So we have circular folds covered in villi. Each one of those is covered in cells that are full of microvilli. Those microvilli form this little brush border, and there are brush border enzymes that are in the plasma membrane of the cells that line the villi, and those do huge amounts of breakdown. But it says these two structures greatly increase the surface area of the small intestine for absorption. You already know, you've already heard me say it, it's three structures. Circular folds, which are the one not mentioned in the book, covered with villi, which are covered with microvilli. All right, so that's fine. If you want, ask me about the extreme circular folds that we see in sharks. We call that a spiral valve in the intestine. It's insane, it's weird, it's awesome. Moving on. Okay, so here we have the lumen, we have these circular folds, and then on the circular fold, we have villi, and each cell lining the villi is full of a bunch of microvilli. They form this fuzzy brush border. All right. Inside of the villi, you have the blood capillaries, the lacteals, which are lymph capillaries that often carry fat. You have on the outside here, these cells that line the intestine, line the lumen, include goblet cells. Those are mucus makers. They help lubricate the passage of food through the intestine by making mucus. All right, the small intestine. Small intestine continuing, nutrients absorbed into the villi, which contain blood vessels and little lymphatic capillaries called lacteals. Simple sugars and amino acids enter the blood capillaries. Glycerol and fatty acids form little drops called chylomicrons, which enter the lacteals. All those little fatty drops are what make the lymph inside of the lacteals look whitish. After nutrients are absorbed, they're eventually carried to all the cells in the body by the blood. True, but you're probably going to go through the liver first to filter them before you go to the rest of the body. Anyway, so a carbohydrate, that's a polymer we break down into glucose monomers. I mean, not all of them are broken into glucose, but in this case, it's a starch and we break it into glucose. There are other types of monomers of carbohydrates, is what I'm saying, but the goal is to break these big, complex polymers that can't cross the intestinal wall into these little monomers that are easier to bring across. Big protein can't cross. We break it down into little amino acids that can be brought across the intestinal wall. Now, we have big fat globules, and we combine them with bile salts. That breaks them into smaller fat droplets, and those can be broken down by lipase, for instance, but enzymes that digest fats. And then we have little tiny droplets of glycerols and fatty acids, and these chylomicrons, these little teeny tiny droplets, are brought into the lacteals. All right, moving on. So here we have table 1A and 1B. 1A is carbohydrate digestion. 1B is protein digestion, which leads me to believe there's going to be a 1C, where we're going to talk about lipid digestion. Lipid fat digestion is 1D. C is nucleic acid digestion. So for each one of these, it talks about what enzyme does the thing, does the breakdown, what the optimum pH of that enzyme is, where this happens, where it's produced. I know that's a long list, but pay a little bit of attention to it. It's really easy to write questions based on that. All right, so let's talk about lactose intolerance. In fact, I'm going to give you a link for lactose intolerance. First of all, I hate this term. They should call it lactose persistence. But here, I'm gonna pause this and go get an HHMI video for you. Okay, I'm back. I have put into this page with the embedded lecture video, I've added a link to a video from the Howard Hughes Medical Institute about lactose. And I want you to understand the ability to digest lactose is dependent on an enzyme called lactase. Again, the enzyme, you know it's an enzyme because it ends in ase. And this is a great name. It tells you this is an enzyme that digests lactose. It's called lactase. Great. I hate when people talk about lactose intolerance, though, because it'd be more accurate to talk about lactase persistence. What this means is that the enzyme that makes it possible to digest lactose, milk sugar, normally when someone is weaned, when an animal is weaned, the ability to make that goes away. But in humans, some individuals have been able to use it for a longer period of time, and we act like that's the normal. It's lactase persistence. When we talk about lactose intolerance, we act like that's weird or abnormal. That actually is the majority of the people in some places, especially Asia. Anyway, so what happens if you are lactose intolerant? Or another way of saying that, if you are not lactase persistent, what happens is that you stop making, as you grow up, you stop making the brush border enzyme lactase. And that means you can't digest the milk sugar easily, and it's not going to be broken down from a dimer into two monomers and then pass through the wall of the intestine. Instead, it'll just go down the intestine where bacteria can break it down. And this will cause bloating, diarrhea. Well, that'll cause bloating and gas. The diarrhea is your body's like, I don't know what to do with it, get it out. And abdominal cramps. So people who can't digest milk, they have a lot of trouble with many of the things that we eat. Like I said, gas, bloating, and cramps are from anaerobic breakdown of the lactose, and it hurts. So let's move on. Celiac disease. It's an autoimmune disorder. Your immune system goes crazy. There is an immune response to a protein called gluten. Now, that gluten is normally found in wheat, barley, rye. Having gluten in the small intestine, normally it's fine, but if you have celiac, then you're going to get an inflammation response that'll damage the absorption surfaces, the villi, the microvilli in the small intestine. This will cause pain, diarrhea, malnutrition. There is an even more extreme version they call Crohn's disease. And a lot of times people with Crohn's disease actually have to have bowel resection where they're like, oh, that part of the intestine is dying, remove it. All right, this is a check your progress. I'm gonna pause for a few minutes. I want you to read over the questions, see if you can answer them. If you can't, you rewind the video and you watch again to make sure you can answer it. And then we'll move on. Okay. So let's talk about, actually, let's pause it here and then we'll start we'll start another video to get the second half.